At a bustling airport gate, a well-dressed woman steps forward, holding her first-class boarding pass with quiet confidence. But instead of being greeted with courtesy, she's met with a glare and a chilling accusation. This doesn't seem real. The gate agent's voice rises, loud enough for nearby passengers to turn and stare. Whispers ripple through the crowd as the woman's calm professionalism is challenged by blatant skepticism. The situation escalates when security arrives, and every eye watches, waiting to see if she'll be humiliated further. But what no one knows is that this woman is no ordinary passenger, and the truth she reveals will shake the airline to its core. Before we dive into the gripping story of Julia Bennett and the shocking incident at Gate 17, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you're as captivated by this story as we are, don't forget to hit subscribe for more inspiring content like this. The bustling terminal of Westwood International Airport was alive with activity. Families reunited with laughter and tears, while business travelers dashed about, juggling phone calls and laptops. The familiar mix of airport chaos, overhead announcements, the soft hum of luggage wheels, and murmured conversations created a constant, rhythmic buzz. Amid the whirlwind of travelers, Julia Bennett walked with purpose. Her sharp heels clicked confidently against the polished floors, drawing a few glances her way. Clad in a sleek navy suit, paired with a pearl-white silk blouse, she carried an air of professionalism that was both commanding and understated. In one hand, Julia gripped a leather carry-on. In the other, she held her boarding pass, a ticket to first class on her flight to New York City. She wasn't just another traveler heading to a big meeting. Julia Bennett was one of the top attorneys at Global Skies, an airline known for its luxury and innovation. As the company's chief legal officer, her job often required meticulous preparation and a calm head, skills that had propelled her through countless courtroom battles and corporate negotiations. However, the journey today was about more than a simple meeting. Julia had been tasked with presenting a legal defense for a high-profile case that could shape the airline's future. The stakes were high, but she was no stranger to pressure. As she approached Gate 17, Julia took in her surroundings with her usual sharp eye for detail. Years of experience had trained her to notice subtle nuances, a twitch of a client's lip, the shift of a rival attorney's gaze, or the mood of a jury. Today, her observations were less about legal strategy and more about the ebb and flow of the passengers waiting to board. The gate agent stood behind the counter, radiating impatience as she scanned the boarding passes of travelers. Her name tag read Chloe Adams, and her expression bore the distinct mark of someone who had long grown tired of her job. Julia noted the way Chloe's eyes flicked over each passenger, lingering a fraction of a second longer on some than others. It wasn't just fatigue, there was judgment in her gaze. Julia joined the line, her calm demeanor masking the small flicker of apprehension in her chest. She was used to being underestimated. Throughout her career, people had often looked at her and doubted her abilities, only to be blindsided by her precision and determination. When it was finally her turn, Julia stepped forward and offered her boarding pass with a polite smile. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice professional and composed. Chloe barely glanced at her, her eyes instead darting to the ticket. The agent's brow furrowed slightly as she scrutinized the document. Without warning, Chloe raised the boarding pass, holding it between two fingers, as though inspecting a counterfeit bill. "This doesn't look right," Chloe announced, her tone louder than necessary. The words hung in the air like a fog, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Conversations slowed, and Julia could feel the weight of their stares. Maintaining her composure, Julia responded, "I can assure you the ticket is valid. Please check your system, and you'll find my reservation." But Chloe didn't move toward her computer. Instead, she crossed her arms, her expression a mix of smugness and skepticism. "We get a lot of people trying to sneak into first class. I'll need to call security to verify this." The accusation hit Julia like a slap. It wasn't just the words, but the way Chloe said them, sharp, dismissive, and loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Julia took a steadying breath. "You're welcome to call security if that's necessary, but I'd appreciate it if you handled this with the same courtesy you've shown the other passengers." Chloe's smirk deepened. I'm just doing my job, ma'am. Please step aside while I verify. The agent's tone was laced with condescension, and Julia could feel the heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck. Still, she refused to let it show. Years of facing high-pressure situations had taught her the value of remaining calm in the face of provocation. Julia stepped aside, gripping the handle of her carry-on tightly as she observed Chloe interacting with the other passengers. A man in a rumpled suit approached the counter next, his boarding pass barely glanced at before he was waved through with a smile. Julia's jaw tightened. The contrast was stark, and it was clear Chloe wasn't just verifying tickets. She was judging who belonged in first class and who didn't. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers arrived at the gate. One of them, a tall man with a buzz cut and a stern expression, stepped forward. His badge read Thomas Grant, and his demeanor suggested he took his job seriously. What seems to be the issue here? Officer Grant asked, looking between Chloe and Julia. This passenger is attempting to board with what appears to be a fraudulent ticket, Chloe said, her tone dripping with exaggerated professionalism. Fraudulent? Julia's voice was calm, though there was a slight edge to her words now. I paid for this ticket, and I have the receipt to prove it. Grant glanced at Chloe, then back at Julia. May I see your identification, ma'am? Julia reached into her handbag and handed over her driver's license, along with the printed receipt from her ticket purchase. As Grant examined the documents, Julia met his gaze with unwavering confidence. After a moment, he nodded. Everything checks out. There's no indication this ticket is fraudulent. Chloe frowned, clearly displeased by his assessment. Well, I still think it's suspicious, she muttered. You don't see someone like her in first class very often. The words hung in the air, sharp and pointed. Julia felt a surge of indignation but forced herself to remain composed. This wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Miss Adams, Grant said, his tone firm now. If there's no evidence of fraud, she's allowed to board. Chloe didn't back down. I'll need to confirm with my manager. Julia exhaled slowly, her patience thinning. As Chloe reached for the phone, Julia thought to herself, You're about to learn exactly who I am. The tension at gate 17 was palpable as Chloe Adams spoke into the phone, her voice dripping with self-importance. Julia stood off to the side, her presence commanding despite the humiliating spectacle unfolding around her. Passengers in the boarding area whispered among themselves, some casting sympathetic glances her way, while others openly stared. Julia remained stoic, though her grip on her carry-on tightened. She wasn't just frustrated, she was angry. Years of navigating subtle biases in boardrooms and courtrooms had taught her how to mask her emotions, but today's blatant display of disrespect was testing her limits. Across the gate area, the 2 security officers lingered awkwardly. Thomas Grant, the taller of the 2, shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Chloe with the faintest hint of doubt in his eyes. His partner, a younger officer who seemed less sure of himself, avoided eye contact with Julia altogether. Bookmark? Meanwhile, Chloe continued speaking into the phone, her words tinged with exaggerated urgency. Yes, I need the gate manager to come down immediately. We have a situation with a questionable first-class ticket. Her tone suggested she was reporting a major security breach rather than simply verifying a passenger's reservation. Julia adjusted her blazer, her movements deliberate and composed. She was not someone to make scenes, but she also wasn't about to let this slide. Today wasn't just about her ticket, it was about principle. Moments later, the gate manager arrived. Liam Price, a man in his early 30s with a crisp navy suit and a neatly trimmed beard, approached the group with a purposeful stride. His expression was calm, but carried a note of unease as he took in the scene. Miss Adams, Liam said, addressing Chloe with a firm but neutral tone, what seems to be the issue here? Chloe straightened, clearly relishing the chance to explain herself. This passenger, she said, gesturing toward Julia, presented a ticket for first class that I believed to be fraudulent. I called security to intervene, but I wanted to confirm with you before taking further action. Julia stepped forward, her posture confident yet unthreatening. Good afternoon, Mr. Price. My name is Julia Bennett. I've already provided my identification and proof of purchase to Officer Grant, who confirmed that everything checks out. Despite that, Miss Adams has continued to question the validity of my ticket. Liam glanced at Officer Grant, who gave a curt nod. That's correct. The ticket is valid and her documentation is in order. Chloe's confident demeanor wavered slightly, but she quickly recovered. Well, it just didn't seem right, she said, her voice faltering. She didn't act like a first-class passenger. The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Liam's jaw tightened and a flicker of irritation crossed his face, though he quickly masked it with professionalism. Miss Adams, Liam said, his tone measured but firm. Our job is to verify tickets, not to make assumptions about who belongs where. Turning back to Julia, he offered an apologetic smile. Miss Bennett, I sincerely apologize for this inconvenience. Please allow me to personally escort you onto the plane. Julia didn't move. Her sharp gaze was locked on Chloe, who now looked distinctly uncomfortable. Thank you, Mr. Price, Julia said, her voice calm but resolute. However, before I board, I believe it's important to address what just happened here. Liam blinked, caught off guard. Of course, we can discuss this in private if you'd prefer. Julia shook her head. No, I think we should address it here. After all, it didn't happen in private. The boarding area grew quiet as passengers strained to listen. Julia turned to Chloe, her voice steady but cutting. You accused me of presenting a fraudulent ticket without any evidence. You dismissed the documentation I provided and implied that I didn't belong in first class based solely on your assumptions. Is that correct? Chloe opened her mouth to respond, but faltered under Julia's piercing stare. I was just trying to do my job, she stammered. Julia tilted her head, her expression unyielding. Doing your job does not include treating passengers with bias or disrespect. Your actions weren't just unprofessional, they were discriminatory. Liam cleared his throat, stepping in to regain control of the situation. Miss Bennett, I assure you this will be addressed. Miss Adams will be placed on suspension pending an internal review. Julia inclined her head slightly. Good. I'll be following up personally to ensure that this review is thorough. She reached into her carry-on and retrieved a business card, handing it to Liam. His eyes widened slightly as he read the embossed text. Julia Bennett, Chief Legal Officer, Global Skies. Chloe's face turned pale, and her earlier smugness was replaced with visible panic. I didn't realize, she began, her voice trembling. That much is clear, Julia said coolly. She turned to Liam, her tone firm but composed. Please ensure that this flight departs on time and that no other passengers have to endure what I did today. Liam nodded hastily. Of course, Miss Bennett, right away. As Julia walked down the jet bridge toward the plane, she felt the weight of every passenger's gaze on her back. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The message had been sent. The air inside the jet bridge was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded moments earlier. Julia Bennett walked with measured steps, her heels clicking against the metallic floor as she approached the aircraft. She adjusted her blazer, her fingers brushing away invisible creases as though resetting her composure. Stepping onto the plane, Julia was greeted by a pair of flight attendants whose practiced smiles faltered slightly when they recognized her. Though polite, their eyes betrayed a mix of curiosity and concern. They had clearly heard about the scene at Gate 17. Good afternoon, Miss Bennett, one of them said warmly. Welcome aboard. Julia inclined her head in acknowledgement but didn't linger. Her focus was on reaching her seat and leaving the ordeal behind. She navigated the aisle toward the first-class cabin, her posture straight and unyielding despite the whispers and glances from other passengers. Sliding her carry-on into the overhead compartment, Julia settled into her seat, a spacious leather recliner near the window. The quiet hum of the aircraft and the soft glow of the cabin lights created a tranquil atmosphere, a welcome respite from the tension that had weighed on her moments before. Julia fastened her seatbelt, her movements deliberate. As she adjusted the seat's position, she noticed a man sitting across the aisle, a businessman in his 40s who had been at the gate earlier. He had spoken up on her behalf during Chloe's confrontation, and now he offered her a tentative smile. I'm glad you made it on, he said in a low voice, leaning slightly toward her. Julia returned his smile, her tone warm but reserved. Thank you for speaking up back there. It wasn't your responsibility, but I appreciate it. The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. It shouldn't have happened in the first place. That gate agent was out of line. Julia studied him for a moment, considering her response. Out of line is putting it lightly, she said finally. But unfortunately, it's not the first time I've encountered someone like her. His expression darkened. It shouldn't happen at all. Julia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let his words settle in the air, a reminder of the pervasive nature of biases she had faced throughout her life and career. The man's indignation was genuine, but it also carried a naivety that Julia no longer shared. As the plane began its taxi down the runway, Julia leaned back against the plush seat and closed her eyes. The familiar hum of the engines was a comforting backdrop, but her thoughts were anything but restful. She didn't act like a first-class passenger. The words echoed in her mind, each syllable laced with the sting of judgment and assumption. Julia had faced countless veiled insults and coded language in her career, but Chloe's blatant prejudice had cut deeper than most. This wasn't just about being denied boarding, it was about being deemed unworthy and told she didn't belong. But Julia had learned long ago that anger alone wasn't enough. Anger needed direction, a purpose. She had built her career on turning moments of adversity into catalysts for change, and today would be no different. Reaching into her carry-on, Julia retrieved her tablet and stylus. If there was one thing she knew, it was that preparation was the best antidote to frustration. With a few taps, she pulled up the airline's employee conduct policies. Her sharp eyes scanned the document, her fingers moving with practiced precision as she highlighted sections and added annotations. She wasn't just looking for answers, she was planning her next steps. The sound of footsteps interrupted her focus. Looking up, Julia saw the lead flight attendant approaching. A woman in her early 40s, the attendant exuded professionalism, but there was a gentleness in her expression that set her apart from Chloe Adams. "Excuse me, Miss Bennett," the attendant said softly. "Mr. Price asked us to ensure you're comfortable. If there's anything you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to let us know." "Go back," Julia offered her a polite smile. "Thank you, but I'll be fine." The attendant hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry you had to go through that back at the gate. It shouldn't have happened." Julia's smile softened. "I appreciate that. Thank you." With a nod, the attendant retreated, leaving Julia to her thoughts. For the next hour, the flight was uneventful. Julia worked steadily, reviewing sections of the conduct policies and drafting notes for a report she intended to compile upon landing. Her focus was sharp, but her mind occasionally drifted back to the confrontation. Across the aisle, the businessman glanced at her again, his expression curious. Finally, he cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Forgive me for asking," he began cautiously, "but are you someone important?" Julia chuckled softly, setting her tablet aside. "That depends on who you ask," she replied. "Why do you ask?" "Well," he said, leaning forward slightly, "you handled that situation at the gate like you'd done it 100 times. And the way the gate manager reacted when he realized who you were, it's not something you see every day." Julia regarded him for a moment, debating how much to reveal. Finally, she said, "I'm the chief legal officer for Global Skies. Situations like that aren't new to me, unfortunately. Neither is what caused it." His eyebrows shot up. "Chief legal officer? That explains a lot." Julia shrugged. "Explains why I didn't back down, maybe. But it shouldn't take a title to be treated with basic dignity." "You're right about that," he said, his tone thoughtful. "But I'll tell you one thing, I wouldn't want to be in that gate agent's shoes right now." Julia smiled faintly but didn't respond. She wasn't interested in retribution, she was interested in accountability. That distinction, she knew, was crucial. As the flight prepared for landing, Julia felt a sense of calm settle over her. The confrontation at Gate 17 had been draining, but it had also reinforced her resolve. This wasn't just about one incident, it was about setting a precedent. The wheels touched down smoothly, the familiar jolt of the landing gear pulling Julia back into the present. She watched through the small window as the city skyline came into view, a blend of sharp modern angles and historical grandeur. The hum of the engines slowed, and the passengers began to stir, collecting their belongings and preparing for disembarkation. Julia took her time. She had no desire to rush, allowing the aisle to clear before standing and retrieving her carry-on. Her mind was already at work, outlining the steps she would take. She left the plane. The confrontation at Gate 17 had been an embarrassment, But more importantly, it was a symptom of a much larger issue. Julia intended to ensure that no one else endured what she had that day. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, the lead flight attendant was waiting for her with a small envelope in hand. "This is from Mr. Price," the woman said, her tone measured but kind. Julia accepted the envelope with a polite nod. "Thank you." She opened it as she walked, revealing a handwritten note. "Ms. Bennett, I deeply regret the events of today and assure you they will not be overlooked. Thank you for your patience and professionalism. Please do not hesitate to reach out if there's anything more I can do. Sincerely, Liam Price." Julia folded the note and slipped it into her bag. While she appreciated the gesture, she knew that a handwritten apology wasn't enough. Change required action, not just words. The terminal was as chaotic as ever, but Julia moved through it with purpose. Outside, a driver stood by the curb, holding a sign with her name, his demeanor professional and efficient. "Good evening, Miss Bennett," he greeted her, opening the door of a sleek black sedan with a practiced flourish. "I hope your flight was pleasant." Julia slid into the cool leather seat. "It was productive," she replied, her tone clipped but polite. As the car merged into traffic, Julia retrieved her phone and opened her email. At the top of her inbox was a message from Liam Price. The subject line read, "Follow-up from Gate 17. Julia scanned the email quickly. Liam reiterated his apology and emphasized that Chloe Adams's behavior would be investigated thoroughly. He assured Julia that Global Skies valued its passengers and maintained a strict zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. It was a carefully worded corporate response, one Julia had both written and received many times before. She knew the tone well, was professional, apologetic, and designed to mitigate potential fallout. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she typed a brief reply. "Mr. Price, thank you for the prompt follow-up. I will review the outcome of your investigation personally. Please forward all relevant documentation to my office by the end of the week. Best, Julia Bennett." She hit send and leaned back against the seat, her gaze shifting to the city lights blurring past the window. Liam's email was a step in the right direction, but Julia knew that real accountability required more than polite apologies and internal reviews. It required structural change, and that was where her focus lay. Arriving at her hotel, Julia wasted no time settling in. She unpacked only what she needed, her movements methodical, as she arranged her laptop and files on the sleek desk by the window. The view of the city skyline went unnoticed as she logged into Global Sky's internal system. Julia's fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, navigating to the company's employee training records. Within moments, she located Chloe Adams's file. As she scanned the data, her suspicions were confirmed. Chloe had completed only the bare minimum of the company's mandatory anti-discrimination training. Her performance reviews, however, painted a more telling picture. Efficient but abrasive with passengers, needs improvement in conflict resolution and communication. The warnings had been there, but no one had acted on them. This wasn't just Chloe's failure. It was the company's failure to address a pattern of behavior before it escalated. Julia leaned back in her chair, her mind working through the implications. Global Skies had policies in place to prevent incidents like the one at Gate 17, but policies meant nothing if they weren't enforced. If her role as chief legal officer meant anything, it was to ensure that those policies were more than just words on a page. The next morning, Julia arrived at Global Skies' regional office, a sleek glass building that gleamed in the sunlight. She was greeted by the receptionist, who directed her to the conference room, where a meeting with the human resources team had been scheduled. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Liam Price was already there, looking more composed than he had at the gate, though his posture was still tense. Beside him sat Karen Yates, the HR director, her expression a mix of professionalism and unease. "Good morning, Miss Bennett," Karen said, standing to shake Julia's hand. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with us." Julia returned the handshake firmly. "Good morning. Let's get started." As she took her seat, Liam began with yet another apology. Julia listened patiently but didn't let him linger. "Apologies are appreciated, Mr. Price, but what I'm more interested in are solutions. Let's talk about the steps being taken to address this." Karen cleared her throat, shuffling a stack of papers in front of her. "We've initiated a formal review of Ms. STUNS Adams's conduct, as well as the training protocols at Gate 17. Additionally, we've scheduled new training sessions for all Gate staff to ensure compliance with company policies. Julia nodded but pressed further. And what about accountability? This isn't just about one employee. It's about a culture that allowed this to happen. Are we looking into why Miss Adams's previous performance issues weren't addressed sooner? Liam glanced at Karen, who hesitated before replying. That's part of the review process, she said carefully. We're also evaluating our oversight mechanisms to prevent similar incidents in the future. Julia leaned forward, her gaze steady. Good. This isn't just about protecting passengers, it's about protecting the company. Incidents like this don't just damage our reputation, they expose us to legal liability. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Liam and Karen exchanged a glance, and Julia knew she had made her point. The meeting with Liam Price and Karen Yates had been productive, but Julia knew it was only the beginning. Addressing the incident at Gate 17 wasn't just about disciplining Chloe Adams. It was about dismantling the systemic issues that had allowed such behavior to thrive. Back at her office later that afternoon, Julia began piecing together the next steps. She drafted a detailed report outlining her immediate recommendations, emphasizing the need for stricter enforcement of training requirements, closer monitoring of employee performance, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. Her report wasn't just focused on Chloe Adams. It was a blueprint for cultural change within Global Skies. Julia knew that the key to lasting reform wasn't punishing one individual. It was ensuring that no one else could perpetuate similar behavior unchecked. As she finished typing, Julia's assistant knocked on the door, peeking her head in. "Miss Bennett," she said, holding a thick folder, "these are the records you requested from HR. They include incident reports and performance reviews for the Gate staff at Westwood International." "Thank you, Kelly," Julia replied, accepting the folder. The folder was heavy, both literally and figuratively. Julia opened it and began reviewing its contents. Each document painted a clearer picture of the culture at Gate 17, and what she found was deeply troubling. Several complaints had been filed against Chloe Adams over the years. Spoke condescendingly to passengers, dismissive attitude toward customers from diverse backgrounds, failed to de-escalate situations, often escalating them instead. Yet, despite these red flags, no meaningful action had been taken. Each complaint had been met with a cursory warning or a note in her personnel file. It wasn't just Chloe. Julia noticed a troubling pattern among other staff at the gate. Complaints from passengers and even fellow employees were frequently brushed aside, labeled as minor infractions or misunderstandings. The systemic failure was glaring. As she sifted through the records, one complaint caught her attention. It was filed 2 years earlier by a young black man who had been denied boarding despite having a valid ticket for business class. Chloe Adams had written a report accusing him of being hostile and aggressive, which led to the complaint being dismissed without further investigation. Julia's stomach churned as she read the details. Several employees had disagreed with Chloe's account but hadn't spoken up, citing fear of retaliation. This wasn't just about bias, it was about complicity. Julia set the file down, taking a moment to compose herself. She had faced many challenging cases in her career, but something about this situation felt personal. Perhaps it was because she had experienced the same kind of prejudice firsthand. Or perhaps it was because, as chief legal officer, she felt a deep responsibility to root out the systemic failures that had allowed this culture to fester. Later that afternoon, Julia called Liam Price for a follow-up conversation. His voice came through the phone, calm but tinged with nervous energy. "Miss Bennett," he said, "thank you for following up. I wanted to update you on the actions we've taken so far. Chloe Adams has been placed on unpaid leave pending further review, and we've started scheduling additional training sessions for all gate staff." Julia's tone was measured but firm. "That's a good start, Mr. Price, but I've been reviewing the records from Westwood International, and I have some concerns. There seems to be a pattern of inconsistent handling of complaints. Why is it that incidents at smaller regional airports are often addressed swiftly, while complaints at major hubs like Westwood are frequently dismissed?" Liam hesitated. I can't speak to the broader trend, but I'll admit there's pressure at larger hubs to keep operations running smoothly. Sometimes that means prioritizing efficiency over other issues. Julia's voice sharpened. Other issues like ensuring passengers aren't discriminated against? Efficiency doesn't excuse negligence, Mr. Price. We have a duty to enforce our policies equally, regardless of location. You're right, Liam admitted, his voice quieter now. I should have pushed back more. I'll do better. This isn't about assigning blame, Julia said, but it is about accountability. I'll need your cooperation as we dig deeper into these patterns. Of course, Liam replied. As the call ended, Julia leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became that Chloe Adams wasn't the root of the problem. She was a symptom of a much larger issue. That evening, Julia drafted a company-wide memo. Her words were deliberate and precise, aimed at addressing not just the employees at Westwood International, but the entire organization. Subject: accountability and change at Global Skies. To all staff, recent events at Westwood International have highlighted the need for reflection and reform within our organization. As a company, we pride ourselves on our commitment to fairness, equality, and professionalism. However, these values mean little if they are not upheld in our actions. Moving forward, we will be implementing new measures to ensure accountability at every level. These include mandatory oversight for all passenger complaints, additional training for frontline staff, and an external audit of past incidents to identify areas for improvement. Change is never easy, but it is necessary. Together, we can create an environment where every passenger and employee is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Sincerely, Julia Bennett, Chief Legal Officer. Julia hit send, watching as the email entered her outbox. It was a small step, but an important one. The following week, Julia received the preliminary results of the external audit. The data confirmed her suspicions. Discrimination complaints at larger hubs were disproportionately dismissed compared to those at smaller regional airports. Managers at the major hubs, under pressure to maintain smooth operations, often buried complaints under layers of bureaucracy. The findings were damning but also validating. Julia now had the evidence she needed to push for meaningful change. The following days were a whirlwind of meetings, emails, and late nights as Julia prepared for what she knew would be one of the most important presentations of her career. The findings from the external audit were undeniable, and they pointed to systemic flaws in the way Global Skies handled complaints at its larger hubs. Julia's goal was clear. She needed to convince the board of directors to commit to real, structural change. The board meeting was scheduled for Friday morning. By Thursday night, Julia had finalized her presentation, meticulously crafting each slide to highlight the key data and its implications. Graphs and charts illustrated the stark disparity in complaint handling between major hubs and regional airports, and case studies, including her own experience at Gate 17, added a personal, undeniable edge to her argument. Arriving early at the sleek conference room in the Global Skies headquarters, Julia set up her materials. The room was bathed in natural light, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. As the directors began filing in, their expressions ranged from curious to apprehensive. They knew the topic of today's meeting, and they knew Julia Bennett didn't mince words. Once everyone was seated, the chairman, a gray-haired man named Edward Parker, opened the meeting. "Ms. Bennett, you requested this session to discuss the recent incident at Westwood International. We're all eager to hear your findings and recommendations." Julia stood, her posture confident as she began speaking. "Good morning," she said, her tone calm but commanding. "As many of you know, an incident occurred last week at Westwood International involving a gate agent and a passenger, me." Her opening statement was met with a ripple of murmurs. She let the room settle before continuing. "While this may appear to be an isolated case, the investigation has revealed deeper issues within our operations. Today, I'll be presenting findings from an external audit of our complaint handling processes, which expose a troubling pattern of systemic failures." Julia clicked on the first slide, which displayed a stark bar graph comparing complaint resolutions at major hubs versus regional airports. Over the past 3 years, 68% of complaints filed at major hubs were dismissed without investigation, compared to just 23% at regional airports. This discrepancy is not coincidental. It reflects a culture that prioritizes operational efficiency over fairness and accountability. The room grew quiet as Julia advanced to the next slide, which detailed specific examples, including the complaints filed against Chloe Adams. Case after case shows a consistent pattern of passengers being dismissed or ignored, particularly those who don't fit a certain profile. The incident at Gate 17 wasn't unique. It was symptomatic of a broader issue. One director, a man named Gerald Walker, with a skeptical expression, leaned forward. "Ms. Bennett, these are serious allegations. Are we certain this is systemic and not just a series of isolated incidents?" Julia met his gaze without hesitation. "With all due respect, Mr. Walker, the data doesn't lie. When nearly 70% of complaints are dismissed at major hubs, while smaller airports handle them appropriately, it's clear we're dealing with a systemic issue." She advanced to the next slide, which outlined the legal and financial risks of ignoring these problems. This isn't just an ethical issue, it's a liability issue. Incidents like the one at Gate 17 expose us to lawsuits, damage our reputation, and erode the trust of both passengers and employees. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Another director, Sophia Green, known for her pragmatic approach, spoke up. "What's your proposed solution, Miss Bennett?" Julia clicked on the final slide, which displayed her recommendations in bold text. "First, we implement mandatory oversight for all complaints. Every dismissal must be reviewed by a newly established accountability committee. Second, we create a direct line for employees and passengers to report incidents to a neutral third party, ensuring transparency and objectivity. Third, we commit to a quarterly review of complaint handling, with results shared transparently across the company." She paused, letting her recommendations sink in before adding, "These measures are not optional if we are serious about addressing this issue. They represent a cultural shift, a commitment to fairness, accountability, and integrity." Edward Parker leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. "This is going to require significant resources and a strong commitment from leadership, but I agree it's necessary. Let's move forward with Ms. Bennett's recommendation." The room buzzed with quiet conversations as the other directors nodded in agreement. Julia felt a surge of relief, but knew the real work was only beginning. After the meeting, Julia returned to her office, her thoughts racing. The board's approval was a victory, but it also came with immense responsibility. She had to ensure the implementation of these reforms was thorough and effective. Later that evening, Julia received an email from Liam Price. The subject line read, "Additional follow-up." Opening it, she found a detailed account of interviews Liam had conducted with other gate agents who had worked with Chloe Adams. Their testimonies were damning. She was always more patient with certain passengers. Her tone shifted noticeably when speaking to people she didn't seem to like. She had a way of making some passengers feel like they didn't belong. Liam's email ended with a personal note. "Ms. Bennett, I want to thank you for holding us accountable. This incident has been a wake-up call for me as well. I should have done more to address these issues sooner, and I'm committed to supporting your efforts to create a better environment for our passengers and staff. Sincerely, Liam Price." Julia sat back, letting the words sink in. Liam's acknowledgement was a small but meaningful victory. It showed that the ripple effect of her actions was starting to take hold. A week after the board meeting, Julia arrived at Westwood International Airport for a training session she had personally arranged. This wasn't just about addressing the incident at Gate 17, it was about setting a new standard for accountability and respect throughout the company. The conference room at the airport was modest but functional, with rows of chairs arranged neatly around a podium. Employees from various departments, including gate agents, security personnel, and supervisors, filled the room, their expressions ranging from curious to apprehensive. Julia stood at the front, calm and composed, though her presence commanded attention. She wasn't there to chastise or intimidate, she was there to inspire change. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady and deliberate. "I'm Julia Bennett, Chief Legal Officer for Global Skies. Some of you may have heard about the incident that occurred here last week. I want to make one thing clear. My presence here is not about assigning blame. It's about ensuring that every employee has the tools and support they need to do their job with integrity and respect. The room was silent, the employees hanging on her every word. We all have biases, Julia continued, her tone measured. It's part of being human. But when those biases influence how we treat our passengers or colleagues, we fail. Not just as employees, but as people. That's why we're here today. To learn, to grow, and to ensure that incidents like the one I experienced don't happen again. As Julia spoke, she made a point to connect with her audience, meeting their eyes and pausing to let her words sink in. She shared stories from her own career, including moments when she had faced bias and had to overcome it. I know what it feels like to be underestimated, she said, her voice softening. I know what it feels like to have someone decide, before you've said a word, that you don't belong. But I also know that change is possible, and it starts with us. Right here, right now. The training session included interactive exercises designed to help employees recognize and address their own biases. Julia observed as small groups worked together, discussing scenarios and sharing personal experiences. While some were hesitant at first, the atmosphere gradually shifted. By the end of the session, the room buzzed with engaged conversations. Toward the close of the session, a young gate agent approached Julia. She was in her early 20s, with a nervous energy that reminded Julia of herself at the start of her career. Ms. Bennett, the agent began hesitantly, I just wanted to say thank you for being here, for speaking up. I think a lot of us needed to hear this. Julia's expression softened. Thank you, she replied. And thank you for being willing to listen. That's where change starts. That evening, as Julia prepared to leave the airport, she reflected on the day's events. The training session had been a success, but it was only the first step in a much larger process. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but Julia was determined to see it through. Back at her office, Julia reviewed the preliminary results of the external audit. The data continued to paint a stark picture. Complaints about discriminatory behavior were not only more common at larger hubs, but also less likely to result in meaningful action. Julia drafted a memo summarizing the findings and sent it to the Accountability Committee, a newly formed group tasked with overseeing complaint handling across the company. Subject: Initial findings on complaint handling. Dear committee members, as part of our ongoing efforts to improve accountability at Global Skies, I'm sharing the preliminary findings from our external audit. The data highlights significant discrepancies in how complaints are handled at major hubs versus regional airports. These findings reinforce the need for consistent oversight and transparency. I urge the committee to prioritize the following: implementation of mandatory complaint reviews at all locations, standardized training for all frontline staff, quarterly audits to assess progress and identify areas for improvement. Thank you for your commitment to this important work. Sincerely, Julia Bennett. Julia hit send and leaned back in her chair, her mind already shifting to the next steps. The following week, Julia attended a follow-up meeting with the Accountability Committee. The members, a mix of executives and department heads, had reviewed the audit findings and were prepared to discuss their implementation plans. Julia opened the meeting with a clear directive. Our goal isn't just to address what happened at Gate 17. It's to prevent incidents like it from happening again. That means holding ourselves accountable at every level. The committee discussed the proposed reforms in detail, from the logistics of quarterly audits to the creation of a neutral reporting line for passengers and employees. Julia was encouraged by the group's engagement, but she remained vigilant. This is about more than policies, she said firmly. It's about culture. If we don't change the way we think about accountability, these policies will mean nothing. That evening, Julia received an email from Liam Price. He had continued to interview employees at Westwood International, and their accounts further underscored the need for systemic change. She had a pattern of favoritism. Passengers who didn't look the part were treated differently. Complaints were dismissed because no one wanted to rock the boat. Liam's email ended with a note of personal reflection. Miss Bennett, I've learned more in the past 2 weeks than I have in years. Thank you for challenging us to do better. I'm committed to supporting these changes and ensuring that Westwood International becomes a model for fairness and professionalism. Sincerely, Liam Price. Julia smiled faintly as she read the email. Liam's transformation was a test. In the weeks following the training session, Julia could feel the momentum building. Across the company, employees and managers alike were beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. The Accountability Committee had already begun reviewing complaints from the past 3 years, and their findings were both validating and unsettling. The discrepancies in complaint handling were glaring. Complaints involving discrimination or bias filed at major hubs were often buried, dismissed, or deemed unsubstantiated. In contrast, similar complaints at smaller regional airports were taken seriously, resulting in disciplinary actions or mandatory retraining. Julia prepared a report summarizing these findings, which would be presented at the next executive meeting. The data wasn't just a critique of past failures, it was a roadmap for how the company could move forward. On the morning of the executive meeting, Julia arrived at Global Sky's headquarters early, armed with her presentation. The boardroom was already filled with department heads and senior managers, their expressions a mix of anticipation and nervous. Edward Parker, the chairman, greeted her with a nod. "Miss Bennett, I trust you have some important updates for us." Julia returned his nod, taking her place at the head of the table. "Good morning, everyone. Today I'll be presenting the results of the Accountability Committee's initial review and outlining the next steps in our reform process." She clicked on the first slide of her presentation, which displayed a heat map of complaint activity across the company's major hubs and regional airports. Over the past 3 years, nearly 70% of discrimination-related complaints at our major hubs were dismissed without investigation, Julia began. In contrast, similar complaints at regional airports resulted in action over 75% of the time. This disparity isn't just troubling, it's unacceptable. The room was silent as Julia advanced to the next slide, which outlined case studies illustrating the human impact of these failures. "These aren't just statistics," she continued. "Each data point represents a passenger or employee who felt unheard, dismissed, or excluded. And as we've seen, this isn't just about individuals, it's about the systemic culture that allowed these patterns to persist." Gerald Walker, the skeptical director who had questioned her at the previous meeting, leaned forward. "Ms. Bennett, these findings are concerning, but how do we address something as ingrained as culture? Policies can only go so far." Julia met his gaze directly. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Walker. Culture doesn't change overnight, but it starts with accountability from the top down. That's why I'm proposing a multi-pronged approach." She clicked to the next slide, which outlined her recommendations. 1. Mandatory complaint review protocols. Every complaint must be reviewed by the Accountability Committee, ensuring no case is dismissed without proper investigation. 2. Enhanced training programs. All employees from frontline staff to senior management will undergo mandatory training on bias recognition, de-escalation techniques, and fair treatment practices. 3. Transparent reporting mechanisms. A neutral third-party hotline will be established for employees and passengers to report concerns without fear of retaliation. 4. Quarterly accountability reviews. The results of all complaint investigations will be shared transparently across the company, fostering a culture of trust and openness. Julia paused, allowing the room to absorb the gravity of her words. These measures represent a significant investment in both time and resources, but they are necessary if we're serious about creating lasting change. Sophia Green, the pragmatic director, nodded thoughtfully. "It's ambitious, but it's also essential. I support moving forward with these initiatives." Edward Parker turned to the rest of the table. "Any objections?" When none were raised, he nodded firmly. "Let's move forward with Miss Bennett's recommendations." "Julia, thank you for your leadership on this." Back at her office later that day, Julia felt a mixture of relief and determination. Securing the board's approval was a significant victory, but it was only the beginning. Real change would take months, if not years, and it would require vigilance at every level of the organization. That evening, Julia received a message marked confidential in her inbox. The email was from a former employee at Westwood International, someone who had worked under Chloe Adams for several years. Subject: "Thank you for speaking up. Dear Miss Bennett, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. I've been following the changes you've initiated, and I wanted to share my experience. During my time at Westwood International, I witnessed several incidents involving Miss Adams that left passengers feeling humiliated or unfairly treated. Unfortunately, many of us felt powerless to speak up at the time. Your actions have given me hope that things are finally changing. Thank you for standing up for what's right. Sincerely, a former employee. Julia's heart tightened as she read the message. It was a reminder of how far-reaching the impact of her work could be. This wasn't just about one incident or one employee. It was about transforming an entire organization. The next week, Julia attended a follow-up training session, this time at a smaller regional airport. The atmosphere was noticeably different from the one at Westwood International. The employees here were more engaged, and their questions reflected a genuine desire to learn and improve. After the session, one of the senior gate agents approached Julia. He was an older man with silver hair and a kind smile. "Miss Bennett," he said, extending his hand, "I've been with Global Skies for over 20 years, and I've seen a lot of changes. What you're doing here matters. It's not easy, but it's necessary." Julia shook his hand firmly. "Thank you. It's people like you who make this possible. Change starts with those willing to lead by example." As she left the airport that evening, Julia felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey was far from over, but each small step brought her closer to the kind of company and world she wanted to help build. The weeks that followed were a test of perseverance for Julia and the Accountability Committee. Implementing the new measures wasn't easy. There was resistance from some senior managers, skepticism from employees, and logistical challenges at every turn. But Julia had expected these hurdles. Change was never easy, and it often required confronting uncomfortable truths. One of the most significant challenges came during the first quarterly accountability review. The results of the review revealed patterns of negligence in handling complaints that extended beyond Westwood International. Similar issues were found at other major hubs, where managers prioritized efficiency and public relations over fairness and proper investigations. In one particularly damning case, a complaint involving a senior gate agent at another major hub had been dismissed outright. The passenger, a woman traveling with her 2 children, had accused the agent of speaking to her in a condescending manner and making remarks that implied she was unfit to fly first class. The agent had denied the claims, and the case was quickly closed, with no follow-up. Julia presented this case during a meeting with the Accountability Committee, her tone measured but resolute. "This isn't just about isolated incidents," she said. "It's about a culture that allowed these incidents to go unchecked. We need to be better, not just for our passengers, but for our employees as well." The committee members nodded in agreement, but Julia could see the weight of the revelations in their faces. For many of them, this process had been an eye-opener. Meanwhile, Julia continued to receive messages from employees and passengers who had heard about the reforms she was leading. Some expressed gratitude, while others shared their own experiences with bias and discrimination at Global Skies. One email stood out. It was from Liam Price, the gate manager at Westwood International, who had been instrumental in supporting Julia's efforts since the incident at Gate 17. Subject: Update on Westwood International. Dear Miss Bennett, I wanted to share some progress we've made here at Westwood. Since the training sessions, I've noticed a significant shift in the way our staff interacts with passengers. There's a greater emphasis on patience, professionalism, and respect. I've also received positive feedback from passengers who feel the difference. I know we still have a long way to go, but I wanted you to know that your efforts are making an impact. Thank you for challenging us to do better. Sincerely, Liam Price. Julia smiled faintly as she read the email. It was a small victory, but it reaffirmed that change was possible. The first major test of the new accountability system came when the committee reviewed the findings of the investigation into Chloe Adams. The evidence against her was overwhelming, not just from the incident with Julia, but from a pattern of behavior that had been documented over several years. In addition to passenger complaints, multiple employees had come forward to share their experiences working with Chloe. One colleague described her as abrasive and dismissive, particularly toward passengers who didn't fit her preconceived notions of a first-class traveler. Another recounted an incident in which Chloe had refused to assist a passenger with limited English proficiency, leaving the passenger visibly distressed. The committee deliberated carefully, weighing the evidence and considering the broader implications of their decision. Ultimately, they recommended Chloe's termination, not as a punitive measure, but as a necessary step to uphold the company's values and set a precedent for accountability. Julia reviewed the committee's findings and approved their recommendation. It wasn't a decision she took lightly, but it was the right one. Chloe's actions had not only violated company policy, but also undermined the trust of Global Sky's passengers and employees. The announcement of Chloe's termination was accompanied by a memo from Julia to the entire company. Dear team, today I want to reaffirm Global Sky's commitment to fairness, respect, and integrity. The recent investigation into incidents at Westwood International has highlighted the importance of holding ourselves accountable at every level. As part of this commitment, we have taken disciplinary action where necessary and are implementing new measures to ensure that all employees uphold our core values. This includes enhanced training, improved oversight, and a renewed focus on creating an inclusive and respectful environment for everyone. Accountability is not about blame, it's about growth. Together, we can build a culture that reflects the very best of who we are. Sincerely, Julia Bennett. In the months that followed, the ripple effects of Julia's reforms were felt across the company. Employees reported feeling more supported, knowing their concerns would be taken seriously. Passengers began noticing subtle but significant changes in how they were treated, from check-in to boarding. At Westwood International, Liam Price continued to lead by example, working closely with his team to reinforce the principles of fairness and respect. He frequently reached out to Julia for guidance, seeking her advice on how to navigate challenges and maintain the momentum of change. One afternoon, Julia received a call from Liam. His tone was lighter than usual, carrying a note of optimism. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I wanted to let you know about something that happened today. One of our newer gate agents handled a particularly difficult situation with a passenger who was upset about a delayed flight. She de-escalated the situation beautifully, and afterward, she told me she'd use techniques she learned during the training session you led." "That's wonderful to hear," Julia replied, a smile spreading across her face. "It's moments like these that remind us why this work is so important." "They really do," Liam agreed. "Thank you again for everything you've done. You've inspired all of us to be better." Julia ended the call feeling a sense of fulfillment. The changes she had fought for were taking root, and while there was still much work to be done, she could see the impact of her efforts. Months had passed since the confrontation at Gate 17, and Julia Bennett could see the results of her efforts woven into the fabric of Global Skies. The company was no longer just reacting to complaints. It was actively fostering a culture of fairness, transparency, and respect. Julia's inbox was no longer filled with messages detailing systemic failures or ignored grievances. Instead, she received updates from the Accountability Committee about meaningful actions taken to address issues at every level of the organization. There were stories of employees stepping up to intervene in difficult situations, passengers commending staff for their professionalism, and managers making intentional efforts to support their teams. One such email came from a gate agent at a regional airport, someone Julia had met during one of her training sessions. Subject: "Thank you. Dear Miss Bennett, I wanted to thank you for the changes you've helped bring to our company. A few days ago, I handled a situation where a passenger was visibly anxious about flying for the first time. Instead of rushing through the interaction, I remembered what you said during the training session about empathy and patience. Taking those few extra moments made all the difference." The passenger later thanked me, saying I had turned what could have been a stressful experience into a positive one. "It's these small moments that remind me why I love what I do. Thank you for helping us rediscover that. Sincerely, a grateful employee." Julia smiled as she read the email. It was proof that the changes she had fought for were creating ripples, touching not just policies but people. One morning, Julia found herself at Westwood International Airport once again, this time as a passenger on her way to another business trip. The scene was familiar, the hum of announcements, the clatter of luggage, and the rhythmic shuffle of travelers. As she approached the gate, she noticed something different. The gate agents, now wearing badges that read "Here to Help," were greeting passengers with genuine warmth. One agent even went out of her way to assist an elderly woman struggling with her carry-on bag, earning a heartfelt thank you in return. Julia handed over her boarding pass, and the agent smiled as she scanned it. "Welcome aboard, Miss Bennett. Thank you for flying with us." There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, no assumptions about whether she belonged. Taking her seat in the first-class cabin, Julia allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought back to the incident at Gate 17, the humiliation, the indignation, and the resolve it had ignited in her. It hadn't been easy to stand her ground, to demand better. Not just for herself, but for everyone. And yet, as she looked around the cabin and saw the quiet efficiency of the flight attendants, the relaxed demeanor of the passengers, and the general sense of harmony, she knew it had been worth it. Back at the Global Skies headquarters, the Accountability Committee was finishing its quarterly review. The results were promising. Incidents of discrimination had dropped significantly, and employee satisfaction scores were on the rise. For the first time in years, the company was seeing a noticeable improvement in its reputation among passengers and industry peers alike. At the close of the meeting, Edward Parker, the chairman of the board, addressed Julia directly. "Bennett," he said, his tone sincere, "your leadership has been instrumental in turning this company around. The changes you've implemented are making a real difference, and we're grateful for your dedication." Julia inclined her head, her expression calm but appreciative. "Thank you, Mr. Parker. This has always been a team effort. I'm just glad to see the results of everyone's hard work." That evening, Julia returned to her office and reviewed the final report on Chloe Adams's termination. The report noted the steps the company had taken to address the systemic failures that had allowed her behavior to persist for so long. It wasn't just about Chloe, it was about preventing future incidents by holding everyone to a higher standard. As she read the report, Julia's assistant, Kelly, appeared at the door with a smile. "Miss Bennett, your car is here," she said. Julia nodded and gathered her things, slipping the report into her bag. As she exited the building and stepped into the cool evening air, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in months. The driver greeted her warmly as she slid into the car. "Good evening, Miss Bennett. Long day?" "Always," Julia replied with a small smile. As the car pulled away, she glanced out the window at the city lights. The journey wasn't over. There would always be more work to do. More challenges to face and more systems to improve. But for now, Julia allowed herself to savor the progress she had made. Global Skies was far from perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. And as long as Julia Bennett was at the helm, it would continue to do so. In the months and years to come, Julia's efforts would become a cornerstone of Global Skies culture. Employees and passengers alike would come to see her as a symbol of accountability and integrity. The incident at Gate 17 had been a painful reminder of the work that still needed to be done, but it had also been a catalyst for change. Julia had turned a moment of adversity into an opportunity to transform not just a company, but the lives of countless people who would benefit from her resolve. As she leaned back against the plush leather seat of the car, Julia allowed herself one final thought. This was only the beginning. The story of Julia Bennett is a powerful reminder of the importance of standing firm in the face of injustice. Her journey highlights not just the personal strength it takes to confront bias, but also the responsibility of organizations to create cultures of fairness and respect. Julia's ability to turn a moment of personal adversity into a catalyst for systemic change is inspiring. It demonstrates how persistence and accountability can transform not just policies, but lives. From her calm composure during a humiliating ordeal to her relentless pursuit of meaningful reform, Julia's actions underscore the value of resilience, leadership, and integrity. Her story teaches us that even in environments resistant to change, one person's courage and commitment can spark a ripple effect that reshapes entire systems. For viewers, This story is a call to reflect on how we treat others, whether in professional settings or daily life. It's also a reminder of the impact we can have when we demand better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Did Julia's journey inspire you? If you found her story compelling, comment with a 1. If it left a lasting impression, comment with a 2. And don't stop there. Share your own stories with us. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to stand up for what was right? Let us know in the comments. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more meaningful stories like this one. We value your thoughts, so be sure to share them in the comments below.